When my son got married, I never told anyone about the $53 million I inherited from my late husband. I kept quiet and stayed in the background. Thank goodness I did, because just a few days after the wedding, my new daughter-in-law showed up at my front door with a lawyer and a stack of papers. She thought she knew exactly what she was entitled to. She was very, very wrong. My husband's name was Harold, not Harry. He was particular about that. Harold. He said his mother had named him after her own father, a man who had worked the same plot of farmland in rural Ohio for 60 years without complaint, and he carried that name like it meant something. I suppose it did. I suppose he did. We met in the spring of 1977, which feels like a different country now. I was 24 and substitute teaching at the elementary school 3 blocks from where I grew up, saving money to move somewhere larger, somewhere that had a coffee shop that stayed open past 7. Harold was 26 and had just signed the lease on a 300-square-foot retail space in a strip mall on the edge of town. Hardware, plumbing supplies, lumber by the foot. The sign above the door was hand-lettered, slightly uneven on the right side, and he never fixed it because he said it reminded him that he had done it himself. I walked in one Saturday in April looking for caulk to seal the window in my studio apartment and walked out 2 hours later, having agreed to dinner on Friday. He wasn't handsome in the way that stops you cold. He was handsome in the way that adds up. The kind of face you looked at and thought, this person knows what they're doing. He had careful hands. He listened when you spoke. He made decisions slowly and then stuck to them, which I found exasperating for the first 3 years and essential for the next 40. We were married in November of 1978. The ceremony was in the fellowship hall of the church where his mother volunteered, and the reception was potluck. I made 3 casseroles and borrowed a card table from the neighbor. Harold wore a suit he had bought on sale and had tailored by the dry cleaner on Main Street. My dress cost $60 at a shop that has since been a pizza place, a vape store, and now, apparently, a nail salon. We were not, in that moment, people who had any money to speak of. We were people who were glad to have enough. The first store stayed small for longer than Harold had planned. He had underestimated how long it takes for a town to trust a new place, and overestimated his own capital. There were 2 winters in the early 80s where we ate a lot of beans and rice, and I graded papers at the kitchen table while he sat across from me doing inventory by hand in a composition notebook. He never complained. Not about the larger situation, the grinding uncertainty of those years. He seemed to understand intuitively that complaining about the shape of your life is a way of avoiding the work of changing it. Our son was born in 1983. We named him Jackson, after the street where the first store stood. Harold cried in the delivery room, which surprised me. I had seen him move through difficult moments with remarkable steadiness, and I had half assumed that equanimity extended to all things. It didn't. He held that boy and cried quietly for several minutes, and when I asked what was wrong, he said nothing. Nothing at all. Everything is exactly right. By the time Jackson started kindergarten, Harold had opened a second location. By the time Jackson was in middle school, there were 5. The growth was not flashy or fast. It was the kind of accumulation that happens when you show up every day, treat your employees fairly, and reinvest most of what you earn back into what you're building. We did not move to a larger house. We did not buy new cars. We took 1 vacation a year, the same rented cottage on the coast every August, and those weeks were among the best of our lives. Harold had a philosophy about money that I absorbed over time the way you absorb the rules of a household, not through formal instruction, but through watching how someone lives. He believed that visible wealth was a form of vulnerability. He believed that people who understood money kept it quiet. He drove the same truck for 12 years, a dark blue pickup with a crack in the passenger side mirror repaired with electrical tape. When I suggested he might consider something newer, he said, "The truck works. A new truck would just be a way of telling people I have money to spend on things I don't need, and I don't want those people's attention." The business kept growing. By the mid-90s, there were 14 locations across 2 states. By 2004, 23, stretching across the Midwest. Harold stepped back from the daily management and used the time to read, work in the garden, and spend Saturday mornings sitting across from me at the kitchen table doing nothing in particular. Those Saturday mornings are what I miss most. The particular quality of quiet that exists between 2 people who have been in the same rooms long enough that silence has become its own form of conversation. 3 years before Harold died, a national chain made an offer to buy the business. He had been approached before, twice in the late 90s, once more in 2008, and had declined each time without much deliberation. This time, he sat with the offer for several weeks. He was 62 years old. His knees had been giving him trouble for 2 years, and though he would never have admitted it, the energy required to manage 23 locations across 4 states had begun to wear on him in ways that his usual discipline couldn't entirely conceal. I would watch him some evenings sitting in his chair in the study, not reading, not doing anything, just sitting in a way that was different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was restful. This was something else. We talked about the offer carefully and at length. Harold was not a man who made large decisions quickly, and this was among the largest decisions of his life. The stores were not just a business to him. They were 40 years of himself, the accumulated result of every early morning and late night, and difficult call and smart bet and painful loss. Selling them felt to him like a kind of reckoning, though he was careful not to be sentimental about it in a way that clouded his thinking. In the end, he accepted. The sale closed in the spring, and the number that arrived in the accounts was $50 million before tax, 38 after, growing from there with Thomas's careful management. Harold seemed lighter after the sale, in the way a person is lighter when they put down something they had been carrying for so long they had stopped noticing the weight. He lasted 18 months. The diagnosis was pancreatic cancer, which is a sentence that doesn't leave room for much hope. The oncologist was direct without being unkind, which I have always been grateful for. Harold listened to everything the doctor said and then asked 3 precise questions, and then he thanked the doctor for his time, and we drove home without speaking. When we got home, he sat down at the kitchen table and I made tea, and we sat there for a while, and then he said, "All right, let's figure out what we're going to do." He fought. That's not a cliche in his case. It was a specific, organized, methodical engagement with the illness, the same way he had approached every difficult problem in his life. He researched treatment options with the same rigor he had once applied to site selection and supplier contracts. He ate what he was supposed to eat. He did what the doctors told him. He kept showing up to appointments with a yellow legal pad and a pen and a list of questions, and he filled in the answers in his careful handwriting and took the notes home and read them again. Jackson was there through all of it. He came every weekend for the first year, sometimes more. He called every day. He was the kind of son a parent hopes to raise and rarely does. Present without smothering, steady without performing. He and Harold would sit in the study for hours some evenings, talking about books, about history, about ideas that had nothing to do with illness or death. And I would hear them laughing occasionally through the door and feel something I can only describe as gratitude in its most concentrated form. Harold died on a Tuesday in November, in our bedroom, with his son on one side and me on the other. It was quiet at the end. He had been unconscious for the last 2 days, and then he wasn't breathing, and that was all. I held his hand for a long time after. The hospice nurse was very gentle. I remember the sound of her moving through the house, taking care of things, and being unable to tell if the sound was close or far away. The weeks after Harold's death have a quality in my memory that is difficult to describe accurately. They were not fully real. I moved through them the way you move through deep water, with deliberate effort, meeting resistance at every step. Our attorney handled most of the immediate practical questions. Thomas handled the financial ones. Jackson handled me as much as I would allow, which in those first weeks was not very much. I needed to be in the house. I needed to be in the specific rooms where Harold had lived. I needed to be able to walk into the study and find the yellow legal pads and the pen still in the arrangement of the last morning he had sat there. 6 weeks after the funeral, I drove to the attorney's office for the formal reading of the estate. I wore the same gray sweater I had worn to the hospital on his last day, which was not intentional. I sat in a chair across from the desk and thought about how Harold had always meant to have it adjusted, and that now he wouldn't. The number was $53 million. Not exactly that. There were accounts and instruments and property values that complicated the arithmetic, but Thomas had simplified it to that figure for the purposes of the meeting. I had known Harold built something substantial, but there had been other assets, investments stretching back decades, insurance policies, property I hadn't tracked closely, and Thomas had assembled them all into a single statement in a folder in my lap. I held that folder and looked at the number for a long time. I drove home and sat in Harold's chair in the study and did not move for a long while. Jackson received a trust that would mature when he turned 35, still 3 years away at that point. Harold had chosen that number deliberately and had explained it to me years earlier. I want him to have made something of himself before he knows what he's inheriting. I want him to know his life belongs to him and not to what I built. I kept the $53 million to myself. I told Jackson that his father had taken care of me, that I was comfortable and didn't need to worry, which was true as far as it went. He accepted this without protest. He was not, and had never been, a person who oriented himself around money. The year that followed was the longest of my life. I went through the motions of ordinary life with a persistent sense that I was slightly beside myself, watching someone who looked like me perform the routines of someone who had once been more thoroughly inhabited. I joined a widows group at the community center. I kept in close contact with Doris, my oldest friend, who understood what Harold's absence meant in a way most people couldn't. I tended the garden. I read. I answered the phone when Jackson called, which was every day. Slowly, unevenly, the grief became something I carried rather than something that carried me. My son had always been the kind of person who was complete within himself. I don't mean that coldly. I mean that he had an interior life that was genuinely sufficient, a capacity for his own company that most people spend decades trying to develop and never quite manage. From the time he was a boy, he had been more interested in books than in most of the social architecture around him, not because he was antisocial, but because he had a particular way of engaging with the world that was vertical rather than horizontal, deep rather than wide. He preferred a long conversation with one person to a short conversation with many. He preferred to understand something fully rather than to know many things partially. He had gotten this from Harold, or inherited it, or perhaps both. It's difficult to separate the genetic from the modeled in a household where parent and child share the same temperament. Harold used to watch his son reading and get a particular expression that I can only describe as recognition. Jackson studied literature and linguistics in college, then went further, then further still, until he had a doctorate from a program that accepted 8 students per year and a dissertation that his advisor described to me at the graduation dinner as genuinely important, a phrase academics don't use casually. He took a position at a small university 2 states away, the kind of place with real trees on the quad and a library that smelled the right way, and he built a life there that suited him entirely. A 2-bedroom apartment near campus, 1 room for sleeping and 1 for books, a reliable car that he kept for 8 years, colleagues he respected, students he remembered, restaurants he had favorites at. He was 32 when Harold died, and he was single. He had been in a few relationships over the years. I had met 2 of the women, liked one of them considerably, thought the other was probably not right for him without ever saying so. He didn't seem troubled by being alone. He seemed, if anything, to prefer a particular quality of quiet that a relationship hadn't yet found a way to fit around. I sometimes wondered, in the abstract way that mothers wonder about things feelings they have decided not to voice, whether Jackson would find someone. I hoped he would, not because I needed him to be paired off, but because he had a great deal of warmth to offer, and I thought it was a shame for warmth like that to go largely unmeasured. But I had also raised him to make his own choices, and his father had spent his life demonstrating that the timeline of a well-lived life is not the same as the culturally suggested one, and so I kept my wondering to myself. He was still single when I last saw him at Christmas, 18 months after Harold's funeral, and then, 6 months later, he called to tell me he had met someone. The call came on a Tuesday evening in late spring. I was in the garden, doing the kind of late light weeding that Harold and I used to do together on weekday evenings, him on one side of the bed and me on the other, working toward the middle. My phone rang, and it was Jackson, and when I answered, his voice had something in it I hadn't heard in a long time, something lit. He said her name. He said he had met her at a university fundraising gala 3 weeks earlier. He said she had been standing alone near the fountain in the courtyard, and when she turned around, he had felt, in his words, like the conversation I'd been trying to have my whole life had just walked toward me. He laughed a little when he said that, embarrassed by his own formulation, and I said it sounded like something from one of the novels he taught, and he said that was probably why he recognized it. I was glad for him. I was also paying careful attention, in the way that mothers pay careful attention, when their children are happy in ways that are new. Within 2 weeks of that first phone call, they were seeing each other every day. Within a month, she had a drawer in his apartment. Within 6 weeks, Jackson told me over the phone she had moved in entirely. This was the son who had once told me quite seriously that he valued solitude the way some people valued oxygen, as a baseline requirement rather than a preference. I noted the change and said nothing about it. I met her for the first time when Jackson brought her to Sunday dinner, 6 weeks after they met. I remember hearing the car pull into the driveway and going to the window and watching them walk up the front path. She was wearing something well considered for someone who supposedly hadn't known what to expect from the evening. A dress that was expensive in the careful way expensive things are expensive, the kind where the quality is present without being announced. She was beautiful. I will say that plainly because it is true and relevant. She was the kind of beautiful that reads as a credential in a room, that generates a particular kind of attention, and she moved through it with the ease of long practice. Jackson was carrying a bottle of wine. He was smiling. He held the door for her, and she went through it without quite looking back. In the months that followed, I watched the courtship progress with a speed that didn't fit my son's character. Decisions that should have taken him weeks took days. Adjustments to his life that he had previously guarded carefully, his routine, his space, his money, were made without the deliberate consideration that had always defined him. He bought new clothes, not bad ones, not flashy ones, but new, expensive ones that signaled an adjustment in self-presentation I hadn't seen him make before. He mentioned casually that he was thinking about trading in his car. He described a restaurant where they'd eaten on the weekend, the kind of place where the menu doesn't list prices, with the offhand familiarity of someone trying to convince himself it was normal. 2 months after they met, she moved in. 4 months after they met, he called to say they were engaged. It was a Sunday morning when the call came. I was drinking coffee and reading, doing what I did on Sunday mornings, and I answered immediately when I saw his name on the screen. He said it quickly. The way people announce things they know will require management. We're engaged. I asked Amelia last night, and she said yes. I remember the particular quality of the pause I held before I spoke. I was sitting very still, making sure the silence on my end was not the silence of alarm, but the silence of someone gathering themselves to respond well. That's wonderful news, sweetheart, I said. I meant it in the sense that I wanted it to be wonderful. And then I asked when they were thinking, and he said next month, and I heard something tighten somewhere behind my sternum that I did not let into my voice. Next month, I said. That's very soon. When you know, he said, and I recognized the phrase as one he had not generated himself. It had the sound of something offered to him by someone else that he had not yet had the time to fully test for truth. We talked for a while longer. I asked questions and he answered them. By the time we hung up, I knew 2 things with equal certainty: that my son was genuinely happy, and that I was not sure what he was happy about. The dinner was on a Sunday in July. I cooked a roast and a salad and a potato dish that Harold had always liked, and I set the table the way I set it when it mattered, with the good napkins and the wine glasses that were a wedding gift we hadn't broken in 45 years. I did not do this to impress her. I did it because it was how I marked occasions, and I wanted to mark this one. They arrived at 6. Jackson came through the door first and hugged me and smelled like himself, like the son I had known for 32 years, and for a moment, everything was entirely ordinary. Then she came in behind him, and the evening arranged itself differently. She was dressed more carefully than the occasion required, not inappropriately. Nothing she did was overt enough to name directly, which was something I would come to understand as a consistent feature of her approach, but there was a quality of preparation about her that felt more strategic than social. She had done her hair. Her jewelry was real. She carried a bag that cost more than most people's monthly grocery bills, and she held it with the particular looseness of someone for whom expensive objects are not remarkable. She complimented the house. She said charming, which is the word people use when they mean small. She said cozy. She smiled at everything I said and made eye contact that was a fraction too steady to be entirely natural. And then within the first 20 minutes of sitting down to dinner, she asked about the stores. How many did he have at the peak? Which states? Had he already completed the sale by the time he got sick? Or did the illness overlap with the transition? The questions came in a register of light curiosity, each one surfacing naturally in the flow of conversation, each one requiring an answer that contained financial information. I watched her ask them, and I watched my son answer them with the transparent ease of someone who wasn't tracking what was being asked. I said very little. I said that Harold had worked hard and built something he was proud of, and that we had been comfortable as a result, and I let the vagueness sit in the room without apologizing for it. She received the vagueness with the micro-expression of someone recalibrating, and then she smiled again and moved on. After dinner, Jackson helped me clear the plates the way he always had, and she excused herself to use the restroom. She was gone for nearly 20 minutes. When she returned, something in the room had shifted, a slight change in her affect, a quality of satisfaction that hadn't been there before. I noticed that the door to the study, which I kept closed as a matter of habit since Harold died, was slightly ajar when I passed it on my way to the kitchen. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed, but the door had been closed. I thought about it that night after they left. I thought about the questions and the door and the particular steadiness of her eye contact. I thought about what Harold used to say when someone sat across from him in a negotiation and performed transparency. Watch for what they're not asking. The thing they most want to know is the thing they're circling around. She had been circling. Harold also used to say, trust your gut. It knows things before your head catches up. My gut was sending me a very clear signal, and my head that evening was beginning to agree with it. I did not say anything to Jackson. I was not yet certain enough, and I was aware that the cost of being wrong, of tainting something that was genuinely good for my son with unfounded suspicion, was high. But I made a note of what I had seen, and I filed it carefully in the part of myself that Harold had trained to pay attention to things that don't quite add up. The wedding planning began approximately 96 hours after the engagement call and proceeded with an efficiency that I recognized as purposeful. Within a week, there was a venue. Within 2 weeks, there was a guest list of 150 people, which struck me as a significant expansion from the small ceremony Jackson had originally described. By the end of the month, there was a spreadsheet. She brought it to a Sunday dinner, the three of us this time, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee, going over what she called the logistics. The spreadsheet was detailed and color-coded, and looking at the bottom line, I understood that color coding is the kind of thing you do when you want to make a large number look like the result of careful management rather than unchecked ambition. The total was $68,000. I looked at the spreadsheet for a while. I noted the imported flowers. I noted the celebrity photographer. I noted the venue, which I happened to know charged by the hour. I noted the open bar, which was specified as premium, and the 5-course dinner, and the live band, and the wedding dress, which was listed as designer and carried a comma in its price. Jackson was watching me from across the table with an expression I recognized, the expression of a person who has become aware too late that they have agreed to more than they understood. I said I would be glad to contribute $20,000 as a wedding gift. I said it in the tone Harold used for final offers. Pleasant, unambiguous, not a starting point. She smiled at me in a way that did not involve her eyes. She said that was very generous, that she knew I was in a position to do more, and that the two of them had been hoping I might consider covering the full amount, since this was my only son's wedding, and since the estate Harold left me would certainly make such a gesture comfortable. I looked at her across the table and said that $20,000 was my contribution, and that the two of them would need to make up the difference or scale back the plans. Jackson said Mom quietly, in the particular tone that means, I agree with you, but I can't say so right now. She said nothing more at the table. That evening, Jackson texted me to say she was upset, that she felt most mothers would be more generous, that I should perhaps reconsider. I looked at the text for a moment and then put my phone face down on the desk and went to bed. 2 weeks later, Jackson called to say they had worked it out. He sounded tired in a way that was new. He mentioned carefully that they had taken out some loans to cover the balance. I transferred my $20,000 and did not mention the loans again. I had also, by then, made a phone call of my own. In the weeks that followed the budget conversation, I was methodically removed from the wedding planning. Not confrontationally. Nothing she did was confrontational when a more efficient method was available. It happened through omission. Vendor calls I was supposed to be included in happened without me. Decisions that should have been consultative arrived as announcements. The dress she selected for me as mother of the groom appeared at my door via delivery service, chosen without my involvement, 2 sizes too large. A conservative cut in a color that was technically navy blue but felt, in a more accurate register, like being told to disappear into the background. I exchanged it for something I actually liked. This produced a tense phone call in which she described her vision for the wedding aesthetic and the importance of the family presenting cohesively, and I listened to the whole thing and then said simply that I understood and that I would see her at the rehearsal dinner. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that contains recalculation, and then she said fine and ended the call. 3 days before the wedding, I arrived early to the final venue walkthrough. I had been told 10 o'clock. I got there at 9:15, not with any particular intention, but because arriving early was a habit Harold had drilled into me through 40 years of example. The event coordinator was not yet set up. I found a chair in the lobby and sat down with my phone. She arrived at 9:40, ahead of the scheduled time, but not expecting to be less than the first. She was on her phone. She walked past the lobby without seeing me and stepped into the courtyard, and I heard her voice carrying back through the open doorway in the particular way voices carry when someone believes they are alone. I wasn't listening for anything. I heard what I heard. She was talking about the family money, the sale, her confidence that the amount was accessible, the timeline she had in mind, after the wedding, before things settled, while the emotional weather was still favorable. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't dramatic, she was describing a plan in the straightforward tone of someone who has thought it through carefully and is simply providing a status update to a trusted associate. I sat very still in my chair in the lobby. Outside, the event coordinator's car pulled into the lot, and the conversation on the other side of the wall concluded quickly. She came back through the doorway and stopped when she saw me. A single beat of stillness, barely a second, before before the smile reassembled itself. "You're early," she said. "Harold always said the only meetings worth having are the ones where you're already there when the other person arrives," I replied. He was right about most things. She held my gaze for a moment, making an assessment, then she smiled again, and we proceeded with the walkthrough as though nothing had happened. That evening, I sat in Harold's chair in the study for a long time. The courtyard, the voice, the plan, all of it ran through me again and came out the same way each time. I was not surprised. I was not angry. I was clear, which is a more useful state than either. The following morning, I called Linda. Linda had been our attorney for 22 years, the same woman who had helped us structure the sale of the business and who had handled Harold's estate. She was in her late 50s, methodical, and had the quality of someone who had seen most things go wrong in most of the ways things can go wrong, and had consequently lost the capacity for surprise while retaining the capacity for thoroughness. I sat across from her desk the morning after the venue walkthrough and told her everything. I told her about the first dinner and the questions. I told her about the door to the study. I told her about the budget conversation and the escalation and the text through Jackson asking me to reconsider. I told her what I had heard in the courtyard. I told her what I believed was coming and why. Linda listened without interrupting. She took a few notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You were right to come in now, rather than later. A later date is rarely better." We spent 3 hours in that office. We reviewed every account, every investment, every property. Linda walked me through the existing trust structures and identified the places where the documentation, while perfectly sound for ordinary purposes, could theoretically be subject to challenge given sustained legal pressure and an adversarial interpretation of events. We addressed each one. We set up additional layers. We structured everything in a way that was airtight, not because we expected the challenges to succeed, they wouldn't, but because I wanted her to find nothing to attempt. By the time I left Linda's office, the entire estate was organized in a single consolidated trust with conditions that Harold and I had always intended to establish properly, and had simply never done with the urgency the situation now required. Jackson's eventual inheritance was protected. My own assets were protected. There were no exposed seams. I also had Linda courier a summary folder to me, a document that laid out the structure in clear terms, not technical language, not legal shorthand, but a plain description of what existed, how it was held, and what it would take to reach any of it. I put this folder on the table in my study. Then I went home and prepared for the wedding. The wedding was on a Saturday in early June, the kind of morning that arrives without obligation, bright, still, with that particular quality of early summer light that looks like something good is about to happen regardless of what actually does. I dressed carefully. I wore the dress I had chosen myself, not the one delivered to my door. I did my hair the way I always did it when it mattered. The Grand Lakeside Hotel had been transformed into the kind of venue that communicates, in every surface and arrangement, that a considerable amount of money has been spent. Crystal hung from structures over the outdoor ceremony space. The flowers were excessive in a way that I recognized as intentional. Excess here was the point. The guests moved through it all in the careful way guests move through expensive settings, consciously and slightly deferential to the decor. Harold's old business partner, Martin, who was also Jackson's godfather, found me near the entrance, and we stood together for a few minutes in the way of people who have known each other long enough to not require preamble. He looked at the flowers. He looked at the lights strung between the trees. He said Harold would have thought this was all a bit much, and I said Harold would have said they should have put it toward a down payment. And Martin laughed, and for a moment my husband was present in the way he sometimes still is, in the things he would have said, which I can hear as clearly as if he were standing next to me. The ceremony itself was beautiful in the technical sense. The setting was beautiful. The flowers were beautiful. She was beautiful. That remained consistently true. Jackson stood at the altar looking handsome and also slightly unlike himself, with a tightness around his eyes that I attributed, at the time, to the ordinary nerves of a significant day. His vows were said clearly and with apparent conviction. Hers were said with an awareness of the photographer's position that I noticed and chose in that moment to set aside. I sat through the reception in the way one sits through long events when there is a great deal to observe and nothing useful to say about it. I was seated next to Martin and across from her parents, whom I was meeting for the first time. Her mother was a quiet woman in department store clothes who kept glancing around the room with the expression of someone trying to calculate how much everything cost and arriving at a number that didn't make sense. Her father shook my hand warmly and had the eyes of a person who was not entirely comfortable with what he was observing, but had decided this was not the moment to address it. During the toasts, she raised her glass and spoke beautifully, and referenced the family's security and prosperity in a way that was smooth enough to land as gratitude to those who weren't listening closely. I was listening closely. Late in the evening, I found Jackson alone at the bar for a few minutes. He was on his 4th drink, which was notable for a man who rarely had more than 2. He looked at me with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone who is holding something back because the moment isn't right, or because they haven't fully assembled it yet, or because they have assembled it and are afraid of what it looks like. "Mom," he started, "I need to tell you something about..." She appeared at his side with the silent efficiency of someone who has learned to track peripheral space. She took his arm. She said the photographer wanted them outside. He looked at me for a moment, apologetic. The thing he had been about to say remained unsaid. I kissed his cheek and told him to have a wonderful evening. He hugged me in the way he hugged me when he was small and something had gone wrong, and I held it for a moment before I let him go. They left for Bali the next morning. I watched the house go quiet and sat with the quiet for several days, doing what I had learned to do in the year since Harold died. I tended things. I watered the garden. I read. I called Doris and talked about the wedding, and she listened with the careful attention of someone who was also listening for what I was not saying. I did not say much that I was not saying. I was in a period of watching and waiting, which is different from a period of doubt. The photos from Bali came through on my phone over the following days. Beach photos, resort photos, drinks at sunset photos. They had the quality of images assembled for a specific purpose. Not casual documentation of happiness, but demonstration of it, which is not the same thing. I looked at them and felt something between sadness and resolution. On the 5th day after the wedding, I was in the garden. It was late morning. The roses Harold and I had planted together on our 10th anniversary were in their second bloom of the season, a better bloom than the first, which is what roses often do when you're patient with them. I was doing what passes for thinking in the garden, which is less thinking and more allowing, letting things settle into their true arrangement without forcing them. I heard a car. I looked up. A black Mercedes I didn't recognize came up the driveway slowly and parked alongside my car with the deliberateness of a vehicle whose driver does not expect to be questioned about being there. She stepped out of the passenger side. White pantsuit, sunglasses, composed. The suit was expensive and the composure was practiced, two things that are easy to mistake for each other and are in fact different in kind. A man in a charcoal suit climbed out of the driver's side. He was in his mid-50s, carrying a leather briefcase. His expression had the trained neutrality of someone who attends difficult conversations professionally and has learned to read them before they begin. My son was not with him. I removed my gardening gloves and walked toward them across the lawn and felt, in those 20 or 30 steps, a clarity I had been building toward for several months. Not anger. Anger is effortful. What I felt was closer to the stillness at the center of a long calculation when the answer finally resolves. She said my name. She said this was their family financial advisor, which was a formulation I noted without reacting to. She said they needed to discuss something important. I said of course. I told them to come inside. I made coffee without asking if they wanted it. I brought 3 cups to the table on the grounds that the ritual of it was useful. It gave the hands something to do and the room something to organize itself around, which is an advantage when you are about to have a conversation in which you want to appear unhurried. They sat across from me. She had removed her sunglasses. Without them, she looked younger, which was not softening. It just made the calculation in her eyes more visible, without the frame of the lenses to give it any particular interpretation. The advisor opened his briefcase with a careful deliberateness of someone who has learned that procedural formality can substitute for authority. He removed a folder and a document, and he placed both on the table in front of him, aligned. Then he looked at me in the way professionals look at people they expect to be confused by what they're about to say. He introduced himself. He said he had been engaged by the family, by which he meant the two of them, a marriage now 5 days old, to assist in some estate planning discussions. He said that in the course of that work, certain information had come to light regarding the extent of the assets Harold had left behind. He said this in the tone of someone presenting a discovery rather than a construction. She had found documents, she said, picking up smoothly from where he left off. When they had gone into storage a few weeks earlier to retrieve some of Jackson's old things, she had come across business papers from the sale. The figures were there. She said this as if she were reporting something she had stumbled upon accidentally, and I sat with the implausibility of that for a moment before setting it aside. The advisor slid the document across the table. It was professionally prepared. I will grant them that. The layout was clean, the language was measured, and the figures were presented with the kind of specificity designed to communicate that someone had done serious work. The proposal was for $10 million, transferred within 60 days of the agreement being signed. In addition, a monthly distribution of $25,000 to be reviewed annually. The document characterized this as an advance on Jackson's eventual inheritance, a voluntary gift in recognition of the family relationship, a reasonable arrangement given the circumstances. The advisor explained it with the patient, mildly apologetic tone of someone who knows the number is difficult but believes the logic is sound. He said that Jackson was Harold's only son. He said that the current structure placed my son in the position of waiting, potentially for decades, for wealth that was already in the family. He said that a loving mother, in full health and with complete capacity, might naturally want to see her son established rather than holding the assets in a trust that served no present purpose. I listened to all of it. Then she spoke. She said that if I found myself unwilling to engage with this voluntarily, there were other avenues they had been advised to consider. The estate, she said, had been assembled during a period of Harold's illness, and the question of whether my influence over the process had been appropriate was one a court might wish to review. She said this gently. She said it as if she were relaying difficult information she herself would have preferred not to share. The advisor added, also gently, that there were also questions around capacity, whether someone in my position, at my age, managing assets of this size, might benefit from the kind of formal oversight that certain legal proceedings could establish. I looked at her across the table. I thought about the courtyard at the venue, 3 days before the wedding, and the voice I had heard carrying through the doorway. I thought about the dinner table and the questions about how many stores in which states and whether the sale had happened before or after the illness. I thought about the door to the study slightly ajar in a house where she had been a guest for 3 hours. I thought about Harold, and the truck he drove for 12 years, and the things he said about money, and the things he said about people, and the things he said about time, how it clarifies, how it reveals, how the truth of what a person is made of tends to surface eventually if you are patient enough to wait for it. I had been patient enough. I reached to my side of the table. The folder had been sitting on the table since the morning Linda couriered it over. I had not moved it. I placed my hand on it and slid it across the table to the advisor without ceremony. ceremony. He opened it. He read the first page. He turned to the second. His expression didn't change. He was too professional for that. But something shifted in the room the way a room shifts when its temperature changes, without any single visible cause. Every account was in trust. Every asset was structured. Every potential challenge had been anticipated, addressed, and closed. There was nothing to contest, nothing to petition, nothing to claim, nothing that Harold had not, in the end, protected as carefully as he had protected everything else he built. Quietly, without announcement, and years before anyone thought to look. The advisor closed the folder. He did not look at her. He placed the folder back on the table and closed his briefcase with the particular finality of someone who understands the meeting is over. She stared at me across the table. For the first time since the night she had walked through my front door, since the first dinner, since the questions, since the smile that never reached the eyes, the smile was gone. What was underneath it was not anger exactly. It was closer to the expression of someone watching a long calculation arrive at the wrong answer. I picked up my coffee cup. I had not touched it since I set it down. Your husband is going to need to hear about this visit, I said. Should we call him together, or would you prefer to do that on your own? She said nothing. She stood up. The advisor stood with her. They left the way people leave when there is nothing left to say, without the ritual of goodbye, without the coffee they had not touched, without looking back. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the car back out of the driveway and the sound of it diminishing down the road. The house was quiet in the specific way it is quiet after something that has been coming for a long time finally arrives and passes through. I sat with that quiet for a little while, then I picked up the phone and called my son.